Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to kind of continue our work with drawing in a new direction to account for something that is actually pretty typical or sort of like it's built in to our experience with webcams and smartphones and the way that we're interacting. This idea that, things that are really close to the camera are big, and things that are really far away from the camera are smaller. This is often true of when people talk with their hands in front of a camera or something. But in drawing, it's maybe less obvious. This idea that things that are close to us are big, things that are far away are really small in the drawing. And in a basic way, overlapping objects should follow this rule, but in the way that we perceive reality, our brain just sort of accounts for that. But our eyes are constantly registering, tiny little people in the background and huge people in the foreground. How do we learn how to draw that kind of thing? Well, there are a couple of techniques that we can use, and one of them is called linear perspective. And so we'll do just a little bit of linear perspective work today. To do that, let's grab a fresh sheet of paper, and also you're going to be fishing out a couple of pieces of paper from your art kit that are special. They're outside of your sketchbook. You should have a couple sheets of graph paper. It's sort of a vellum graph paper, sort of semi-transparent, and at least one sheet of a little bit thicker paper. This is actually a Reeves BFK, it's sort of a water-based media or printmaker's paper. Grab one of those sheets of graph paper. This is going to sort of help us set up our linear perspective project. You'll also need a straight edge, and you might eventually want some templates to use as a bit of a cheater. So let's flip over to some blank pages here and do a little demo. So we'll work with two types of linear perspective today. So it's just some basic introduction to one-point perspective and two-point perspective. And I'm actually going to freehand it first, and then I'll bring in some of my crutches, some studio assistants like the graph paper and the straight edge. But for starters, one of the questions would be like, how do I take something like a square and make that appear as though it's occupying space, right? Well, we talked a little bit about how to kind of use parallel lines and kind of block that in, and those sort of real quick renderings do make it appear as though it's filling space. But how might I kind of like tune up this drawing because it's a little bit, flat? Well, if I make some of these lines instead of parallel, but if I make them what are called vanishing, so I start with a vanishing point, and I attempt to make this same drawing here. I'll start with a square, and instead of parallel lines, I use vanishing lines. Each one of these lines is going to vanish back to this vanishing point, and then I come back in with my horizontal and vertical lines. And the way that this really starts to kind of separate itself from our early kind of dimensional drawing forms is when I start to make multiples. So instead, right, of all of my boxes sort of occupying this same sort of abstracted space, I start to have all of my drawings slave to the same vanishing point. In this case, no matter where I draw some boxes in this arrangement here, each one of them occupies the same kind of space as the other box. Similar to when we were doing value studies, if you have a single light source, that single light source provides lighting for all of the boxes, all of the forms that occupy that space. So I'm not erasing any of my vanishing lines at this point, just kind of showing how I might actually get forms to occupy the same dimensional space. Now, this is one-point perspective drawing, one point in the middle, all my vanishing lines travel. Two-point perspective drawings, instead, have two vanishing points, and instead of starting with something like a dimensional shape, like a box, they start with a line. And the line is actually not a facet or a face of the form, but an edge. Let me give an example. Vanishing lines travel back from my edge in the direction of this anchor point, or this vanishing point, and they travel backwards to this vanishing point. You can kind of get the sense that maybe we're standing at the corner of a street or something like that, and this is a long building that travels back in either direction. And in this case, my box is going to end at these two verticals and travel back in space the opposite direction to generate the top of the box. So these boxes, similarly, can all start to occupy the same space together. Okay, and now I've got a dimensional space that seems to sort of make sense. Boxes that are close to me are bigger, boxes that are far away from me are smaller. Okay, so how do we actually learn to render this out quickly? These sort of quick hand renderings are nice, but let's actually use some of our crutches to build a little bit of confidence. First of all, let's use our graph paper. Now the nice thing about the graph paper is that it's going to establish my verticals and horizontals for me so that I don't necessarily always have to be right on with my straight edge. And the more confident we get with this technique, we'll start to break it down. We'll get rid of the crutches and we'll make shapes that are, you know, not so solidly geometric. But let's use our graph paper and just arbitrarily choose one point as the vanishing point, and we're going to start with a 1-point perspective box. Now I want you to imagine that there is a dotted line traveling horizontally through our vanishing point and a dotted line traveling vertically through our vanishing point. We'll come back to those dotted lines eventually. Those of you guys who are up on your geometry, you might call that your XY axis. It's good enough for me for this point. Stay away from those axis lines for this demonstration. I'll explain that why here in a minute. But go ahead and use the graph paper grid lines to make yourself a 1 by 1 inch box. Now 3 of the corners of that box are close to this anchor point. Let's connect each one of those back to the vanishing point. I'm going to do that with a slightly less dark pencil line than my initial ones. All 3 lines vanish back to the exact same point. And now I'm going to end that box along a vertical line. And as long as my horizontal line connects to that vertical, my box starts to sort of pop off the page a little bit. This is sort of an exciting illusion, especially if this has never been a technique you've approached before. But essentially the illusion is, right, that we're no longer working with a flat plane. Now we have the kind of grasp of dimension because the front of this box is shrinking in comparison to the back of the box. Sorry, that's reversed. The back of the box is shrinking away from us. It feels more like the way I perceive objects when I'm just walking down the street. Things that are far away from me are small. Things that are close to me are big. If you want to know how this works exactly, go ahead and draw another box using the same lines that we started with here. That would be the front of the box. And this one is going to be overlapped by the front box, so I'm not going to draw those overlapping bits. And way back here at the back, my tiny little box barely has those lines. Okay, you see how that back box is significantly smaller than this front box? If you're starting to sort of have a problem seeing where these boxes are and where they aren't, it can be helpful to sort of lay in a tone, lay in a value on one side of those boxes or the other. Now, as long as I stayed away from my X, Y axes, I should see 3 sides to these boxes. And if it's helpful, you could sort of shade them in the highlight, midtone, shadow arrangement that we did before. So that maybe the tops of the box are my midtone, the sides of the box are my shadows, front of the box, you know, are my highlights. This is an easy way to sort of differentiate foreground, background. Now, if I start to add more boxes, and this is where I'll explain that whole XY thing, but this time my box overlaps one of my XY axes. something else happens here. So I'm going to look for the 3 corners that are closest to this point. I'm like, oh, not really sure which of the 3 closest corners. I'll at least vanish to this one here. That's a close corner, and I'll vanish to this one here. That's a close corner, and I'm starting to get confused. You know, what am I seeing? Well, think of it this way. These are your horizon lines, and when your horizon, when you start to cross a horizon line or a line of perception, you don't always get to see 3 sides of the same box. Occasionally, you can rotate a box in space and lose track of one of the 3 sides that you might typically see. Instead of seeing front, side, top, or for that matter, if I flip this around, instead of seeing front, side, bottom, I might only see top, front. If I start to fill in that 1-point perspective drawing, you'll get a sense of what I mean here. I'm going to come way out into this sort of open space over here. And with graph paper, this moves pretty quickly because you don't have to keep such tight track over where your verticals are or horizontals. And this box I'll make much larger. You can see how on this side all these boxes are starting to occupy the same space. So when you're practicing this perspective technique, this 1-point perspective, I want you to at least draw 3 boxes, and if you want to challenge yourself, draw boxes that are overlapping. As soon as you start to overlap forms, just like when we were practicing drawing our basic dimensions, our basic 2 or 3D conversions, overlapping forms sort of step it up a little bit. And if you're really bored with that even, practice cutting these forms in space and see what happens, see if you can't figure that out. So what about that 2-point perspective? Well, let's come down here, and I'm going to choose my horizontal line. I'm going to go ahead and just make my dotted line right away, because that horizontal dotted line is going to be important. Up here, I referred to them as sort of the XY axis. In here, I'm going to refer to that as my horizon. These 2 points, I'm going to refer to as my vanishing points. Now, the reason we're referred to as vanishing points is that all of my what otherwise would have been parallel lines, if I was drawing these sort of freehand, instead of being parallel, those are all going to be shifting into vanishing lines. In 1-point perspective drawing, I started with the front or face of a box. In 2-point perspective, I'm going to start with an edge or a line, depending on how you are thinking about this, right? As 3D designers, we should be always thinking in 3 dimensions. A line in 3-dimensional terms is actually an edge. From the top of that edge, I'm going to vanish to my right side vanishing point. From the top of that edge, I'm going to vanish to my left side vanishing point. From the bottom of that edge, I'm going to vanish all the way back to my left side vanishing point. And from the bottom of that edge, I'll vanish all the way back to the right side vanishing point. Now, I'm going to end my box here along a vertical here and a vertical here. And now instead of connecting these points, I'm going to crisscross vanishing points. So from the left side, I'll go to the right side, and from the right side, I'll go to the left side. You see the box kind of jump off the page? I'll lay in just a little bit of shading here so that it starts to kind of pop up for you, even with a little bit of lighting. Again, it can be sort of handy to lay in sort of a shadow, mid-tone highlight, just to sort of differentiate left, right, bottom, or left, right, top. Now, the nice thing about 2-point perspective is that it's actually simpler. It may look more complicated, but there's fewer different kinds of lines. Pay attention to the 1-point perspective. There's horizontal lines, vertical lines, and vanishing lines. That's 3 different types of lines. In 2-point perspective, there's only vertical lines and vanishing lines. There's no horizontals. That simplifies the process for us a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and jump above the horizon here along my same 3 axis points. I'm going to make those sort of lighter for right now, just so I can kind of track right along with the same lines here. Oops, got a little bit off my grid. Okay, so my line sort of travels straight up. I'm going to do the same basic shape, but this time above my horizon. There's the bottom of my box. Now I've established the top. I'll come in on this side. Okay, now I have a front edge and two sides. All I have to do is crisscross my bottom anchor points to get a bottom of that box. With the straight edge, I'll just come in and darken a few of these lines and lay in some values. Now in 2-point perspective, if I transgress the horizon, just like in 1-point perspective, things start to get a little bit strange. So I'll follow along this same arrangement here and attempt to draw a box right smack dab in the middle that transgresses or crosses over the horizon and see what happens. So I'll try to start and stop here, right on the middle. From the top and the bottom of those lines, I'll vanish. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that my box ends at the same point as my other two boxes. But wait a minute, I don't see a top or a bottom. Well, remember, when I'm transgressing or when I crisscross over the horizon lines, and in 2-point perspective, there's only one horizon here right through the middle. As soon as I transgress that, I don't see all three sides. So I have to keep tabs on where my boxes are and where they aren't so that I know what to expect. I shouldn't expect to see a top or a bottom of this box because it's right smack dab in the middle. So in sort of an absolute sense, these are like a very precise kind of way for arranging shapes into perspective drawings, and there's a lot of interesting applications for this sort of thing. Maybe in the most simplistic one, like maybe an architectural designer might have a lot of use for straight perspective in this way. But even just kind of loosely rendering in drawings on a page, you can kind of apply linear perspective ideas to drawings that maybe aren't even so specific, that might just be more loosely referencing this idea of linear perspective, or things that get smaller and smaller and smaller as you move away from you. So let's actually work with an object from life. And so I'll slide away the graph paper and bring in this piece of split bamboo again, and maybe kind of play with this a little bit and sort of think through, like, what would I need to do in order to get circular shapes, not just blocks, and then some of these lines here, right? How would I render in an object like this using perspective? And I'll start with sort of a straightforward or a simplistic version in 1-point perspective, and I'll have it traveling away from me, and maybe I don't know, convert it into a sewer pipe or something in my drawing. So let me go ahead and maybe grab one of my oval templates as a crutch to sort of get the rough drawing begun. I'll go ahead and lay in my sort of quick reference to sort of what I hope to render. So here is the bamboo. It's going to travel back somewhere in this direction. Maybe my anchor point's out there. And then there's a thickness to that bamboo, and I think I want the split to be somewhere toward the top. So this is sort of a quick reference to how I may render this thing in. Why don't I step in with the templates now and just sort of correct for some of my funky drawing here. My outer diameter of the bamboo should be somewhere maybe in here. I'll go and render that in with my 4B pencil. And while I'm here with the 4B, I'm going to mark those cross sections. That way I can quickly create the thickness. If I sort of make my XY axis of that object in space here, now I have a good center that I can work with, and I can decide, you know, how thick that bamboo should be. Somewhere maybe in that range feels about right to me. And so I'm lining up this smaller oval using the marks that I made, that XY axis, and now I have a more or less centered thickness to work with. If that's getting a little bit messy in there, I'll lighten up some of my initial sketch lines, just kind of blow those out. Now I have this, you know, really cool split sort of halfway here, and I think I would like that split to sort of travel back in perspective. So maybe I'll roll that split towards me a little bit and render it somewhere in here. So maybe I'll have that break, the top edge be somewhere in here, and that bottom edge somewhere in there. And those lines are going to have to travel back. Same with these outside lines. Now, any line that's going to be moving back in space should be a perspective line. So let me go ahead and render those out according to my linear perspective. My anchor point is way out here, or my vanishing point is way out there. So I'll use my HB pencil for that guy. Now, as long as I'm making sure to connect always to that one anchor point, my bamboo is now vanishing. Okay, and I suppose I could end it somewhere back here. I'll just kind of decide roughly that it's going to end back there. Now I want these splits in the bamboo to follow the same rules. So I'm going to make sure that I take this top split and cut that one back, and this bottom split, cut that one back, and even that bottom lip here. Okay. I'm going to lift out some of these lines. So now this object is starting to kind of move back in space. And I think I'll add a little bit of sewage to the front here just to sort of animate this drawing a little bit, bring it to life. Perfect, there we go. And I'll finish up this drawing with a bit of value. So let me grab my object again and reference how this might look. Okay, so up inside of my drawing here, I'm going to be building a little bit of value. And all the way back along the edge here, I'll make sure I render that value in. It's really so handy to keep objects around in the studio to make drawings like this a little bit easier. If I had to come up with all this stuff from my head, it'd be a little bit difficult to, say, put the shadows in just the right places. Or okay, starting to feel like the inside of a pipe here. I think I want that, whatever's dripping out of the front here, to carry a little bit more of a blackish feel. Let me bring my 6B pencil in for some really dark graphite. And this is not necessarily following any perspective rules so much as kind of capturing the feel of some sort of organic, horrid schmoo. Okay. Switching to a softer leaded pencil is going to allow me to sort of lay in some of those nice hard crisp lines here, and then I could always come in and render the back side of the tube. Since it's a cylinder, as it rolls away from me, it's going to have a darker back edge. So you see how my contour edges are starting to dissolve as I start to lay in my values. I don't really want to see those. At some point I just want the tube to be all the interplay of different lighting and different shadows. And then maybe to do just a quick render finish on this thing, I'll lay in a ground so that it's not just sitting on a white page. So what I want you guys to work on is I want you to attempt some sort of like true, or maybe what we'll call like pure perspective, like render out some basic forms using 1 and 2 point perspective. But then if you want to have some fun, go ahead and just start rendering out some other drawings and, you know, get a little playful with it. I think kind of this sort of fun way to kind of remember that it's not just pure perspective that we're trying to learn here. We're kind of starting to play with like how I might actually apply some of this, and how could I transform an object that I have sitting in my studio to something massive, almost like on an architectural scale, or, you know, how can I start to play with the way that objects might occupy much larger, different spaces. Drawing really frees me up to do that kind of stuff. And, that's why we're all experimenting with it. I look forward to see what you guys come up with.